Welcome to Reinvent, and the first roundtable in a new series on how to reinvent American foreign policy. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, but I'm also going to be helping moderate this video conversation today. Now, the premise of this new series is that America is at a moment in time where we can and should fundamentally rethink our foreign policy. There's a bunch of reasons for this. One is, in fact, that the world is fundamentally changing. There's a increasing global integration that kind of calls for new approaches to foreign policy. We're facing many of the big challenges that we'll be facing in the coming years here are global in nature, planetary in scale. We have to start thinking differently about how to deal with them. But more importantly, the old approaches haven't necessarily been that effective, particularly the approach of the United States being much more unilateral approaches, and also relying more heavily on military options. And so this series has been we're partnering with our partners in this who share this belief that it's time for a real fundamental rethink. Our partners in this case are the Ploughshares Fund, which is actually helping us pull this off, and three individuals are really underwriting this as well. One is Guy Saperstein, then Daniel Berger, and Katrina Vanderhoven. And we're really grateful for their help in actually making this project come together. Now, it's particularly apropos of this new approach when it comes to Iran. And we've watched how the Obama administration has really shifted kind of a much more diplomatic approach to dealing with Iran. And we've seen through this Iran nuclear agreement, which has really opened up many more possibilities of what we can actually do going forward. And so this roundtable is going to actually build off that deal and look at the possibilities. There's been enough said about the deal itself in other quarters. We're not going to be talking about that here. We're going to be talking about how could that deal be leveraged to improve the relationship with Iran and use that to actually lower levels of conflict throughout. The administration has really shifted it kind of a much more diplomatic approach to dealing with Iran. Sorry, 1 second there. And so basically, that is what we're basically going to do in this roundtable. Now, to help us do that, we have a fantastic anchor in this case, in the form of Stephen Kinzer. Now, Stephen is a longtime New York Times foreign correspondent. He spent over 20 years with the Times, most of that abroad. And he is now still writing for many different publications. And in fact, just yesterday came out with a piece in the Global Post, which is a story entitled, How the Iran Accord Changes Everything. It's totally apropos, totally on point with what we're going to talk about here, and he's going to basically help lead that. He's also written many books related to foreign affairs, and 2 of those books have been dealing directly with Iran, including one that says Reset, Iran, Turkey, and America's Future. Again, very apropos here. Now, we're going to get to him in a minute where he's going to set the table, but before we do that, we've also got an awesome group for this conversation, and we're going to go around the table here and just have everyone just briefly introduce themselves and say what they bring to the table. So in this case, let's start with Joe. Why don't you just introduce you? You could be anchoring this yourself, but let's
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm Joe Cirincione. I'm the president of Ploughshares Fund. I've been working on nonproliferation for over 30 years, so it's a pleasure to join you in this.
And Turkey and America's Future. Again, very apropos. Go ahead. Oh, Joe. So, okay, Joe. Well, let's go to the next person. Basically, Barbara, why don't you jump in?
Sure. I'm delighted to be part of this. I'm Barbara Slavin. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Like Stephen, I'm a longtime journalist as well, and have had an opportunity to travel to Iran 9 times. But for the purposes of this conversation, I run a task force at the Atlantic Council, which is all about Iran, and we're looking forward to building on the nuclear agreement to see what other possibilities are there for bilateral relations and also for regional conflict resolution.
Terrific to have you. Suzanne.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of this stellar panel and see such old friends and new friends. My name is Suzanne DiMaggio. I'm a fellow at New America, where I direct the U.S.-Iran initiative. My key area of focus has been U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East and Asia, in particularly Iran. And for the past 15 years, I've been directing a U.S.-Iran policy dialogue on a range of political, security, and economic issues.
Terrific. Great to have you here. Trita.
Delighted to be here. My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the president of the National Iranian American Council. My organization has been working on this issue for many, many years. And I'm currently writing a book on how the deal actually came about called Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Legacy of Diplomacy.
So we've had a fantastic group here, like I say, but as great as the group is here, and particularly led by Stephen, we always have a saying around here that nobody's as smart as everybody, and we know that people are watching this, have terrific ideas, and also questions they might have. We encourage you to actually add them to the comments section in the landing page there on our Reinvent website, which you're potentially watching right there on it. Add those questions, and if you're in Twitter, use the hashtag Reinvent. We'll be keeping an eye on ideas and questions from there, and we will cycle them in if they're relevant to the flow of the conversation today. So encourage you to do that. So Stephen, given that particularly that piece that just came out that you can again see on our site, we're basically promoting that all through it on the Global Post, why don't you set up the conversation a little bit with some thoughts on why is this such a game changer?
During the last year, the issue of Iran has come to the center of public attention in the United States in a way that it hasn't in decades. We were told during the debate that only a minority of Americans supported the idea of negotiating with Iran. Given what we've been told over the last 30 years, I'm amazed that anybody supported it. What we've been told by leaders of both political parties and the press and just about every source of information is that Iran is a brutal state run by a terror regime. It's part of an axis of evil, and that everything that's good for Iran is bad for the rest of the world. I think those of us who have spent some time studying Iran and traveled there have come to a conclusion that this might be the world's most misunderstood country. It's been cut off from the West for decades, and during that time it's been quite demonized by the world press, much of which has not had much access there. So anybody who's been following what the press and public officials have been saying about Iran over the last 30+ years must conclude logically that it's one of the world's nastiest places. Nonetheless, I think slowly we're beginning to understand that the stereotypes we have might have fit another era, but like so much of our foreign policy, they don't fit the reality of the modern age. You know, I don't go to Washington very often, but whenever I do, I'm struck with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy. You have to accept a whole series of assumptions about American power and the role of the United States in the world in order to participate in a conversation about international politics. The Iran deal fundamentally changes geopolitical strategies and geopolitical approaches. It reorders the world. I think it shows us that the pieces on the global chessboard are not nailed permanently into place. They can actually be moved around. We're now at the beginning of a process. We have great potential ahead of us. We've had a great achievement here, I think, with the approval of this deal. Now the challenge is to implement it, to make it real, and then to see how we can build on that to change the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world. This is a chance for Iran to re-enter the world and for the world to come back to Iran. So we're going to start by asking a couple of questions, and let me start with one and then ask our panelists to try to react to this. During the debate over the Iran deal, it was logical that people who opposed the deal spent all their time listing the evils and sins of the Iranian regime and how important it was to keep Iran isolated and under control. That was to be expected. But what struck me was that even most of the people who supported the deal in the U.S. Congress and outside also said that they supported it because it's a way to keep Iran down. It's the best way to corral Iran. With this deal, we have a better way to keep our foot on Iran's neck and make sure Iran doesn't emerge as a power. very few people were making the argument that actually it's a positive thing to bring Iran out of its isolation, that this could contribute to global stability, that Iran can be a contributor to regional peace. It is not an irrevocably bad actor. So I think what we'd like to know now is Iran truly the irredeemably negative force that we've been told it is? If not, in what ways can Iran take advantage of this deal, and can the world take advantage of this deal, to use Iran's unique network of contacts and power in the Middle East for positive change in that region?
Big question, and let me just say here, I forgot to introduce our other awesome panelist here that I want to actually introduce now, and have her introduce yourself and also address this right off the bat before we go to the flow of everybody else. So Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself and also just jump on the question that Stephen just teed up.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here, and my name is Sarah. I used to run Barim.org, which was an organization focused on advocating for peace and supporting social innovators in Iran. I think this question is incredibly interesting because we talk about the negative perceptions people have of Iran and forget that those aren't just abstractions. They have very real impact on people's lives. And to just point out to an example, there's a movement right now called Justice for Cheyenne, who was a young Iranian American who was unfortunately attacked here and killed. And his attackers actually referenced the fact that he was Iranian in that. So I think in these discussions, it's incredibly important to remember that Iran is a country. The people who live there and the people who come from there are people just like everyone else. And that these negative stereotypes have very stringent real-life consequences. So I'm going to start the ball there and then let my other panelists jump in.
All right, jump in.
Yeah, sure. You know, Stephen, that's a great question. I think we have a certain mindset which is based on our traditional allies. And let's face it, the issue is whether we can build some bridges with Iran, use those bridges to attack problems where our traditional allies are on the other side. So, for example, we now have a meeting to which the Iranians have finally been invited to discuss the Syria war. President Obama called the King of Saudi Arabia the other day, and I think he did that to tell him that we were going to invite the Iranians to come. The Saudis have been very much opposed to that. So I think this is going to be a time in which the United States is actually going to have to be a mediator as much as anything, trying to bring our traditional allies together with Iran to discuss the burning issues of the day. And we're going to talk about Iran and Saudi Arabia later, but that's clearly one of the main cleavages now in the Middle East that's causing so much conflict. So, you know, can we be a mediator between Iran and some of our traditional allies?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this very important question. I think first we have to just be very forthcoming and say and recognize that there are profound differences between us and Iran. But as the saying goes, you make peace with your enemies, not your friends. This is a reality we must face. But as we've seen with the nuclear negotiations, where there's a will, there's a way. Common interests can be found. And it's possible for even long-standing adversaries like Iran and the U.S. to engage in principled and pragmatic diplomacy. The fact is that for nearly 2 years, Iran has been fully cooperating on implementing the interim nuclear agreement. We also have other precedents of cooperation from Iran, most notably on Afghanistan following 9/11. So we now have an opportunity to follow up on the process of the nuclear deal as a model and build on the momentum created by it in an attempt to decrease tensions in the relationship. I think in particular we should be very practical and explore a few key common interests or common threats, if we look at it that way, and take it from there. But this is going to be long and tough, but because of the nuclear deal, we now have a chance to test it.
Can I jump in?
Jump for it.
Yes.
Go for it.
I largely agree with Suzanne. This is going to be challenging, and I think it's worth remembering that even when the United States and China had a détente, it was a very rocky relationship in the beginning, and I think we should expect the same thing here. But when it comes to the question of is Iran an inherently negative actor, can it change or can it not change, I think there's a need for us to go a little bit deeper and look into the Iranian society and see what are the various elements there that can impact Iran's foreign policy. And I think there's something extremely amazing about Iran. Right now, according to the professor Javad Salehi Esfahani, is one of the main foremost professors on the Iranian economy. He pointed out at our conference last week that both Barbara and Joe attended, that Iran currently has a middle class that constitutes about 60% of its entire population. If this deal is successful, and if the sanction relief comes through, and Iran grows with a relatively moderate rate of 5% a year for 10 years, moderate because of the size of the Iranian economy, Iran's middle class in 10 years will be 85% of the population. I don't think you will easily find a country that has an 80% middle class that will seek to play a destabilizing role, that will be a negative actor. I think the prospects are far greater that a country at that stage of development will be an anchor for stability.
Trita, let me follow up on that and ask you to take it a little further. The deal is opening up a lot of business possibilities for Iran. It seems that companies from all over the world, not quite the United States yet, but many countries are arriving in Iran and trying to do business. Do you think that economic ties, business ties between Iran and the outside world will also be a major factor in shaping the way Iran deals with the outside world, or is that going to be strictly business and not affect Iran's geopolitical approach?
I think there are elements in Iran who would like to see the latter. They want to make sure that they have the trade because they would like to have it, but at the same time, I personally find it unlikely that you're going to be able to have that development by having those business connections without seeing that impacting on the behavior. Because right now, prior to this deal, there wasn't much Iran had to lose. The sanctions had already essentially eliminated most of the trade that existed. If Iran engaged in negative behavior, there really wasn't much more else that could be sanctioned. But if you have a situation in which you have that growing middle class, you have economic progress being made, then suddenly engaging in activities that would be very dangerous and that would be counter to the interests of many states in the region, including the United States, suddenly would have a cost, a direct economic cost that the middle class would have to bear. So there's no guarantee, of course, but if you take a look at where would the balance of forces be, it seems to me that the likelihood is greater that a more developed Iran is also going to be an Iran that is going to be more interested in stability.
I'd like to ask a question for follow up on this and ask any of you to comment on this one. Iran has taken on a role as a protector of Shia communities throughout the Middle East. As a result of this, Iran has layers of contacts in Lebanon, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, and Syria that other countries don't have. Now, some actors in the region accuse Iran of having used its Shia network for destabilization. Do you think that given the fact that Iran has a unique set of ties in all the countries that are now in turmoil, can mean that these levers that Iran has at its disposal can be used for a stabilizing purpose, and that Iran could play a role in some of these conflicts that no one else can play precisely because of its ties to Shia factions in other parts of the region?
Joe, why don't you jump in on this one? Go, sorry.
Let Barbara go ahead. I think she's
let me say a couple of things. I wanted to mention, first of all, You know, Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, sent a letter to President Rouhani explaining how the nuclear deal should be implemented. And he's warned that there should not be any negotiations with the United States about any other issues. Well, Iran is joining a conference on Syria on Friday in Vienna, which the United States will be present. So I think we have to be very careful to watch what Iran does and not necessarily what its leaders say. At the same time, though, we have to be very aware of domestic politics in Iran, which can be really cutthroat and brutal. We have to remember that some of our friends are in prison in Iran right now for civil society activities, for simply the crime of practicing journalism in the case of Jason Rezaian. I think it's going to be a very difficult and dicey couple of months, particularly until Iran's parliamentary elections in February, and there's going to be a lot of infighting. And so we should be extremely cautious and careful in the way that we reach out to Iran and in the requests that we place on Iran during this period of time. So I just wanted to inject that into the conversation.
Let me add something here. Barbara, I think that's absolutely right. However, it's actually sort of remarkable how quickly the U.S.-Iranian relationship is developing here. Remember, it was just 10 days ago that the Iran nuclear accord actually went into effect. October 18 was when it cleared all the last hurdles and it actually started. Iran is just now beginning to start to disassemble its nuclear complex here. But 10 days later, we get this invitation from the United States to Iran to join the Syria conflict. Now, the nuclear accord was not about regional conflicts. It wasn't about a broader U.S.-Iran relationship. It wasn't like what Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon did with China, with taking on a multitude of issues all at once. It just did one thing. It stopped Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. But you're seeing the ripples now. It's true. We have to proceed carefully. We don't know what kind of role Iran is going to play. But realists in the American security establishment are looking at this nuclear accord as the gateway, as the opening to these other conversations with Iran. And this is not necessarily a left-right split or a Democratic-Republican split. Henry Kissinger just chimed in on this the other day, saying as long as Iran moderates its behavior, we should be prepared for a dialogue with Iran. Why? Because you need Iran to stop the continuing collapse of the Middle East. It's a real, a traditional realist look at the balance of forces in the Middle East and what the U.S. role should be here, trying to overcome some of the acidic debate that we just went through on the Iran Accord.
I'm glad to see Kissinger slowly coming along, because it wasn't very long ago that he was saying Iran is a greater threat to the world than ISIS. So finally, I think he's coming a little bit closer to reality. That's good to see, even from Kissinger. Now, speaking about great geopoliticians, let me try to take this regional question one step further. The Americans began their plunge into Middle East quicksand at the end of World War II when Franklin Roosevelt met with the King of Saudi Arabia aboard a ship in the Suez Canal and began that relationship. You could argue that that relationship was good or bad, depending on your point of view, but it did have a logical basis. We wanted Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East to be on our side for two reasons. First of all, we needed their oil. And secondly, we wanted them to be on our side in Cold War conflicts. Now, as I suggested earlier, I'm always fascinated with how slowly policies change in Washington. The United States always has great policies to deal with situations that don't exist anymore. Now, the Cold War is over. And the rapidly changing world energy picture also has dramatically reduced our requirement to kneel down to Persian Gulf sheiks. Nonetheless, we haven't changed our policy towards the Middle East and towards the old allies that we needed for reasons that no longer exist. How do we change the geopolitics of the region in a way that recognizes that there are only two big Muslim countries left standing, that is Saudi Arabia and Iran, and tries to inject a measure of American national interest into a political space that has been dominated by an inability to change. America's always talking about how powerful we are in the world, but we also are told that we're trapped. There are certain things we have to do. We can't get away from this. We must stay with that. So great power doesn't seem to endow us with choice. We are not told that power gives us alternatives. To me, one of the great opportunities that this agreement presents is that it gives us new strategic options. It's not a tilt toward Iran, but it gives us new alternatives. What are some of those alternatives, and how can we proceed on a regional basis to calm Saudi Arabia and Iran's fears of each other, and at the same time build on our old relationship with one country, our growing relationship with another one, to try to calm some of the flames that are now consuming that region?
I'll jump in here. On this question, I think this is very ambitious to say, but I think the nuclear agreement now presents us with an opportunity to take a step forward in thinking through exactly what you're talking about, Steve. How to create a new security order in the Gulf. Yes, very ambitious. But let's not forget that even before the nuclear agreement was finalized, President Obama gave some very tough love to our partners in the Gulf, saying that you need to fix your problems yourself and not rely on us so much, and that we're going to start having a new dance partner in the region on some issues, Iran. So for the United States, we now have an opportunity to look at regional strategy for balancing Iran. And I would make 2 points here. One is that there are clearly some countries in the region that would like to achieve a modus vivendi with Iran. In other words, an arrangement or an agreement that allows Iran and Saudi Arabia to coexist peacefully, to agree to disagree, in other words, a balance. And the United States can help play a role working with countries in the region to achieve this. It will not be easy, but I think it's definitely worth trying. And on this point, I would say a deal in Syria, a political settlement to the civil war there, must be a first step in trying to reach this regional modus vivendi. And the second point I just wanted to make is the idea of trying to think through now, again, using our imagination, of taking a first step toward creating a new architecture for security in the region. Can we think about a multilateral security forum at this time? Yes, the GCC exists, but it is in no way inclusive. It doesn't include Iran, it doesn't include Iraq, it also doesn't include any of the outside powers. It's also not focused on security issues or conflict resolution. So I think the moment might be right to talk maybe first informally about a multilateral security forum, what that architecture could look like. This could begin as a track 2 dialogue or a track 1.5 dialogue, but I think there's an urgency to have those discussions now.
Great. Trita, do you want to jump in here? Maybe.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we can't expect to see any significant improvement in security unless there is a deliberate effort to create a new security architecture. And we can learn from the experience of the past. Any effort to build a security architecture that is built on the exclusion of major powers is doomed to fail. That's what happened with the dual containment policy of the United States that was put into place in the early 1990s, that was based on the exclusion of Iran and Iraq. Today, it would be also a mistake to either exclude Iran or Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a major power in the region. If it is excluded, or if it feels that everything is going in the opposite direction of its interest, it's not surprising that it's lashing out and is taking a lot of, I would say, premature or irrational decisions. Everyone needs to be at the table in order to be able to build something that everyone has a buy-in into. And very surprisingly, perhaps, we are already seeing that the United States is not necessarily being a mediator, but is helping create an environment in which both the Saudis and the Iranians would be at the table. The Saudis, as was mentioned earlier on, did object to Iran being at the table. They're the main reason as to why Iran wasn't invited to the previous rounds. Now when the nuclear deal is struck, the U.S. has a little bit more leverage over Saudi Arabia, and as a result has managed to push and make sure that the Saudis had to accept the fact that the Iranian presence is critical. Now it's equally critical to make sure that the Saudis don't boycott.
Oops. Oh, Stephen, you muted. Just unmute there. One question.
Sarah, did you want to add something?
Sure. My answer on this is slightly different. I think for me, the reason why the Iran Accord was so exciting was that it showed that diplomacy and advocating for peace is possible no matter what the political challenges and the regional tensions are, and how important that leadership is in making sure that paradigm is articulated all through our approach to national and foreign policy. So that was just what I'd like to add.
And I'd like to ask Joe, you know, we've heard so much about the proliferation aspect of this accord, which is, of course, its center. We've been told that fears of Iran might lead to decisions by other countries in the region to pursue nuclear programs. Other people argue the opposite, that that countries in the region would be more motivated to pursue their own nuclear programs if there was no agreement. What does this accord mean for the prospects of nuclear proliferation or lack of same in the Middle East?
Thank you, Stephen. You quote President Obama in your article, and where he calls this the strongest non-proliferation regime treaty or agreement ever negotiated. I've been covering this field for over 30 years now. I've seen a lot of agreements, a lot of treaties, and I don't think the president is overstating it. He's not just being a salesman here. This is by far the most rigorous, verifiable, sweeping non-proliferation agreement I've ever seen. And as such, I think it really stops the prospect of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, an arms race that might have been triggered if there had been no agreement, if Iran's program had gone on unconstrained. You would see pressure on Saudi Arabia, on Turkey, on even the United Arab Emirates to try and match that, however difficult, expensive, or lengthy a process that might be. But with this now, with this accord, with the Iranian program moving in reverse, where they're ripping out two-thirds of their centrifuges, getting rid of 98% of their stockpile of uranium gas, pulling out the core of their plutonium-producing reactor, drilling it full of holes and filling it with concrete. I mean, who does that? You know, what kind of agreement requires countries to do that? Very few. And here you see that happening. I think that will dampen any incentive there might have been for other countries to match it. But it does lead to the dynamic that we've been talking about here, then the acceptance of Iran, the emergence of Iran as sort of a rising influence in the area. But this is why this is so aptly titled a roundtable here, this part of this Reinventing Foreign Policy series. We really do now have to reinvent our approach to the Middle East. It's not just a matter of taking Iran and patching it on some existing structure. You have to reconsider the whole arrangement here, and one that recognizes everybody's equities in the region.
And can a new Middle East also help the United States extract itself from that region? Americans are desperate to lighten our footprint there. There's no appetite in the United States for deeper involvement. We know that probably the 21st century is going to be focused on East Asia. Our challenges are more in China, India, Korea, Japan. The more we are caught in the Middle East, the less we're going to be able to address other challenges. Do you think that this accord will help us extract ourselves to a certain degree from the Middle East, or is that too optimistic and something that's not going to happen in our lifetimes?
I, for one, think it's a little optimistic. Should I continue?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, sorry, my screen froze.
For that one.
I think it's a little optimistic, as we've just seen this past week. We now have U.S. boots back on the ground in Iraq, and we're calling them special operations and carrying out with Kurds and others. So I think it's a bit optimistic. But on the other hand, I think it's also important to recognize that. Do you remember that interview that President Obama gave with Thomas Friedman of the New York Times a while back? He essentially said that the U.S. is going to prioritize diplomatic engagement over the use of force. And in that interview, he also voiced very harsh criticism of the governance systems in the Gulf monarchies, basically saying you yourselves are the biggest threat. It's an internal threat. So that was gutsy. That was, I mean, I don't think we heard any other president say it quite like that, and standing up to our Gulf allies and sending a clear message to them that the U.S. will be is following a different approach in the region. Now, certainly the Iran nuclear deal is a big part of that reconfiguration of how the United States approaches the Middle East. But I think, as I said before, we have to proceed on a very careful basis. I don't think the administration will be taking big risks, and certainly won't be relying on Iran to be an ally or a partner anytime soon. But I think the pieces are there to begin fleshing out what this new approach could be. The issue for us is, of course, we have a presidential election underway, and whether or not President Obama's successor will continue this approach.
Suzanne, I think, is correct about the debate that's now happening in the national security establishment about which way to go. I'm a little more optimistic than you are, Suzanne, basically because I think this is where the President of the United States wants to go. You can see that he does not want to get dragged back in. He's trying to extract us. And it's true, he just made a decision to keep U.S. forces in Afghanistan, but it's still relatively low levels. There is this creeping sense that U.S. forces might get more involved in the combat against ISIS. It's a struggle, but the President's direction is clearly to try to get us out. That's one of the great impetuses for Secretary of Kerry to have these conversations with Iran, not just on Syria, but on the Yemen conflict, on the battle against ISIS, on our mutual strategic objectives of stabilizing Iraq, stabilizing Afghanistan. It doesn't mean that having Iran engaged in these conversations is necessarily going to reduce these conflicts, but it's clear that not having Iran in these conversations will prevent us from stabilizing these conflicts. I was struck by something that President Rouhani said at a dinner I attended a couple of years ago up in New York, in fact, that you, Suzanne, organized. And he said something similar in public statements, so I don't feel I'm violating the off-the-record nature of it. But he said that the U.S. and Iran have to learn how to manage their differences. And I thought that was very important. Not overcome their differences, not resolve their differences, but develop this mechanisms, just as the U.S. did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and then with Communist China, a way to manage them so that we reduce the possibility of conflict between the two countries, and where we have overlapping strategic objectives, we can work together. That's the trend. That's where Obama wants to go. In the U.S., and I'll close with this, in the U.S. there's opposition to that. The same people who opposed the Iran agreement, the same people who dragged us into the Iraq War, want to torpedo this agreement, don't want this U.S. relationship to develop with Iran, and they're arguing for greater military presence. Those are the neoconservatives that you see so vocal here. In the middle is Hillary Clinton. In her speech at Brookings Institution last month, she embraced the Iran agreement. She wants to keep the agreement, but she said that's as far as it goes. This is not the beginning of a new diplomatic engagement, and she outlined a policy of new containment with Iran. So Hillary wants containment with some engagement. The president wants engagement with some containment. This is the debate you're going to see develop, at least among the realist schools of thought and the Democratic Party establishment over the next year.
Trita, I'd like to ask you to comment on this, and I'd like you to add something else to this discussion that hasn't come up yet. You are an authority on the complex and often hidden relationship between Iran and Israel. Israel is the country we haven't talked about yet. We are now in the process of increasing military aid to Israel by another $1 billion as a compensation for the Iran deal or as part of this package. So please tell me a little bit about what we were talking about earlier in Iran's role in the region, but I'd also like to hear from you on how you think Israel's perspective is going to play into the unfolding of the realization of this accord.
Oops, Trita, you just got to unmute there. Sorry, you've been muted.
Terribly sorry. Thank you. Let me then start off by adding a little bit to the conversation that Suzanne and Joe had. I agree the president has been a key driving force of this. I think if you objectively look at it, it's difficult to come to a different conclusion, in my opinion, when it comes to the analysis that the United States have been overextended and overcommitted in the Middle East, whereas it actually needs to position itself perhaps a bit stronger elsewhere in the world, because at the end of the day, the peer competitor to America's global standing is not going to come out of the Middle East. And over the course of the last 15 years, we've seen a couple of very important trends that have, all in all, made it much more difficult and far more costly to be the ultimate guarantor of security in the Middle East. So the cost of hegemony has gone up. At the same time, because of other factors, including America's own oil production, the benefits of being the ultimate security guarantor of the Middle East has also significantly dropped. And I think this has changed the calculation that the next administration, even if there is an individual such as President Obama there to continue to push in this direction, would nevertheless have to deal with. But it's going to be tough, and that's why I would also tend to agree a bit with Suzanne on this. It's going to be very difficult because even in the Obama administration, Obama oftentimes finds himself to be alone in the desire to constantly resist getting dragged back into yet another likely quagmire in the Middle East, whereas there has been far more voices in the administration who have been a little bit more gung-ho and who at times perhaps view intervention, essentially equate intervention with leadership, and I think that's something we have to separate a little bit. When it comes to Israel, I think it's really fascinating to see. When I wrote the book Treacherous Alliance and looked at the Iran-Israel-US triangle, it was almost heretic to point out that Israel played such a critical role in the US-Iran relationship. After this summer and after Bibi Netanyahu's speech at Congress, I don't know if there's many people who would still make the argument that Israel has not been a significant component of this entire drama. And it's going to be very interesting to see going forward how that will play out. I think there is going to be a backlash and a rethinking in Israel about whether it was worth it or not, because the cost that Netanyahu has inflicted on Israel itself by challenging Obama in the way that he has and by helping the Republicans turn Israel into a partisan issue, it's going to have long-term impact on the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I'm not saying it's going to collapse or anything like that, but it's not going to be business as usual, I think. I think there's going to be a lot of things that's going to take some time to be able to overcome. And the question is that in this process, if Iran plays its cards right, perhaps there will be a de-Israelization of Iran in the American mindset, in the sense that U.S.-Iran relations will be viewed from many different perspectives, including the Israeli perspective, but not so much exclusively through an Israeli prism.
Trita is Barbara.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I think that's a little optimistic. We are in a presidential election year, and I think Israeli views are going to still weigh very heavily on this, and that there will be people who will be thinking of Israel but finding other pretexts to try to put new sanctions on Iran, to have a very strict interpretation of sanctions relief that will discourage even European companies from going back into the Iranian market. So I think we have to be very cognizant of Israeli concerns. However, I mean, we have to point out, obviously, that Israel is a little bit preoccupied these days with the Palestinian issue. And that is certainly, I think, the first priority for them right now. So it may actually have won us a little bit of space, since there doesn't appear to be any giant Iranian footprint in terms of the kinds of individual attacks that are taking place against Israeli Jews in the Old City and in Israel proper, and even in the West Bank. But I don't think we should be cavalier about Israeli influence over the political process in the United States. It's still there, and of course the Republican candidates, there's not a single one that has come out in support of the nuclear deal so far, and so I think it will figure certainly in the general election debate as well as in the primary debates.
Let me suggest something else about Israel. I feel that in a certain way, Prime Minister Netanyahu's extreme opposition to this deal and to reconciliation between Iran and the outside world promoted the deal. I think he deserves some of the credit for this deal, both over the long term and over the short term. Over the long term, for several years, Netanyahu has been insisting that Iran is always 6 months or 1 year away from a nuclear bomb. He made what sounded like very realistic threats that Israel might take unilateral action to bomb or otherwise attack Iran, and this produced quite some concerns in the United States. We even had a statement from our CIA director, Leon Panetta, essentially saying he's very afraid of these threats, and the United States needed to get involved and try to calm this situation down. Had Netanyahu not reached such a panic level, maybe the United States wouldn't have felt moved to begin this process in the first place. And then secondly, as the agreement was being debated in Congress, Netanyahu's extreme opposition to it, I believe, gave cover to the Iranians inside Iran who were promoting the deal. They were able to say, we're promoting a deal that Israel hates. If the Israelis and Netanyahu had said, well, the deal is okay, either way is fine with us, that might have been used by the hardliners in Iran. So I was prepared to say if Kerry and Zarif had won the Nobel Prize, they really should have given it also to Netanyahu, because in his own way, I think he contributed to it. Now,
go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I think that's very, very interesting and accurate. Netanyahu's threats to attack Iran were not just bluster. We now know that he tried to get his cabinet to approve a strike on Iran, but the defense minister and the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Force didn't want to go along. And it showed the split inside Israel, where the military and the intelligence officials, both in office and out, did not see Iran as the same existential threat that Netanyahu did. And I believe you're right. The fear that Iran was going to do that actually propelled the diplomacy that the U.S. was engaged in with Iran. It gave it a much greater urgency, because the choice became clear. If we did not get this deal, there very well could be a new war in the Middle East. And that's one of the things that also gave the deal the support it had among the American population. When asked to choose, the American population is clear. They're overwhelmingly in favor of an agreement with Iran rather than going to war with Iran.
Now, several of you have brought up a point that I want to focus on more specifically, and that is the unfolding presidential campaign in the United States. Every time during this quadrennial circus, we see candidates competing with each other to embrace the narrative of American exceptionalism, to flex their muscles and beat their chests and promise to make the strongest army in the world, the most dominant force. As you look through history, you can look at presidents from Theodore Roosevelt all the way to Obama, who came into office with an interventionist approach, but slowly, through the experience of office, calmed down. Now, we're about to bring a new president into office. Probably everybody running for the presidency is more interventionist-minded than Obama is now. What is that going to mean for the Iran-U.S. relationship and the prospects for this accord in the first year, let's say, or two after the new president takes office? Barbara, you are a Washington insider, at least compared to many of the rest of us. Can you give us some thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with your premise, Stephen. You know, if you listen even to somebody like Ted Cruz, you know, they are not gung-ho interventionists. And Hillary is a little bit more hawkish on Syria, for example, than Obama is, but I don't think she's a giant hawk either. So I'm not so concerned about that. I think maybe there's annoyance with the Russians and with Putin, that he looks like he's a much more sort of vigorous defender of Russian rights somehow than the United States. But there are plenty of people who are also saying, fine, let him get stuck in a Syrian quagmire and better him than us. So my concern is really about how robustly the nuclear deal is implemented, particularly on the sanctions relief front, because I think Iranians need to see some palpable relief in the economy. And if the people in our Treasury Department, many of whom have been there for 10, 15 years and who are themselves quite hawkish on Iran, if they don't encourage, in particular, Europeans to take advantage of sanctions relief and go back in, if there are more fines put on banks, if there are more arrests connected with American sanctions, that could have a chilling effect. And that's really what I worry about. I also worry about the domestic situation in Iran. I mentioned that earlier. They have elections coming up. And there are Iranian Americans and others who are in prison who should not be in prison. And this is the hardline way of basically saying, to the United States, this isn't even détente. This was a transactional thing that we did to get sanctions relief, but we don't like you, you don't like us, and don't think we're going to do anything more together, and don't think you're going to come into our country and foment a velvet revolution. So I think that the two things that worry me are Iranian domestic politics and, on our side, the Treasury Department.
Joe, does that match your own perspective?
This is going to be a long, tough road. Everybody here on the panel has acknowledged that. And the reason is that there are hardline elements in both societies that don't want a reconciliation, that actually profit from the conflict. In some cases, like the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, they actually profit from their control of the smuggling operations that they've set up to circumvent the sanctions. So it's going to be tough. I look at but if we can tamp down those interventionists, those hardline elements in both societies, the overwhelming strategic imperative for both Iran and the United States pushes them together. We will both benefit from this. It's very similar to the sort of dynamic you saw between the U.S. and China. Not identical, but very similar. So I think that a big parts of the American security establishment recognize that, and the business interests. And this is why, for example, in the campaign you see Donald Trump talk, actually, in some of the most sensible comments he makes are on the Middle East, where he talks about the need that he's not an interventionist. He doesn't want to go in there. He represents that very conservative but more practical-minded element of the Republican establishment. And on the left, you see Bernie Sanders has uncomfortable with foreign policy, much more focused on domestic, but also a non-interventionist, somebody who doesn't want to go in, again, reflecting the desire of the American people who are just sick of the conflicts in the Middle East, sick of the way we've squandered our treasury, the lives of some of our finest warriors, and American credibility in this foolishness that resulted from the invasion of Iraq.
Sarah?
Yes, absolutely. I think what's terrifying is watching knee-jerk political posturing get in the way of real conversations between different actors. An example of this from Netanyahu was during one speech he made an offhand comment about how he really wanted people in Iran to have access to genes. And this caused a Twitter storm of outrage from Iranians and Iranians, and everyone started tweeting Netanyahu photos of their genes. And was just one of those amazing moments where you could see how misconceptions were going all the way up to top decision makers when it came to foreign policy. Another great example of this that we saw only a few weeks ago was in the Democratic debates. When asked who she was proud to have as an enemy, Hillary Clinton named the Iranians. And I know as an Iranian living in the US, I don't consider Hillary Clinton my enemy. And those kinds of off-the-cuff comments, especially from someone who was our top diplomat, is incredibly alarming. And we need to move past these kinds of knee-jerk statements and actually look at the substance. And the one ray of hope I really have in all of these conversations is this deal changed the game for everyday American people. It really showed the power of everyday people and their ability to push Congress on a foreign policy issue and win. And I would argue that as we see these elections going forth, it's going to become harder and harder for interventionists to get elected when that's just not what the people want anymore.
I'll jump in here. So looking at the domestic political scene here in the U.S. and, of course, dominated by the presidential campaigns now, I have to say I'm a bit concerned. I think Joe's point that Donald Trump is not an interventionist is correct, but I take little comfort from that because he's not an engager either. And the other reason I'm concerned is that somewhere along the way, engagement, diplomatic engagement, became a dirty word or a symbol for weakness. If we think back to when we had candidate Barack Obama, his foreign policy platform centered around engaging with adversaries, particularly Iran, and we see what happened with that, but also Myanmar and Cuba. And now we have reestablished diplomatic relations with both those countries. Also, he undertook a very quiet diplomatic engagement with China on climate change, which has turned out to be quite a game changer. And we can add Vietnam, other countries where there's been significant diplomatic engagement. And when I hear the candidates talking, none of them are talking about the power of engagement as a way to have less military adventurism on the U.S. part. So that concerns me. I understand that during an election campaign, people have to flex their muscle, especially if you're a female candidate like Hillary Clinton, and I think to a large extent we see that happening. But at the end of the day, when we hear all the Republican candidates, or many of them, saying that on day one of their presidency they're going to tear up this agreement with Iran on the nuclear deal, I mean, that to me just sounds like a lot of huffing and puffing. What will matter most, of course, is whether or not the Iranians implement the deal. All indications seem to me that they have every intention to implement this deal. They're moving forward on issues of previous military dimensions. We'll soon be seeing videos of dismantlement of centrifuges and so forth, and they're shipping out of their stockpile. So I think that is probably the most powerful response that we'll have to those who are preaching a more interventionist foreign policy, but also those candidates who are saying the nuclear deal is not worth the paper it's written on. It's really going to be dependent on what the Iranians do.
If I may ask, I found here. Sorry, Stephen. I just want to ask one question, follow up briefly on this, on the political side of this, and really, it's a little bit more directed to Sarah, particularly, is because one of the things that's actually happening now is we've got this new generation essentially really starting to make its impact on politics. This millennial generation, they're all over age 18 now and up to 35, and it's a huge generation, and their politics are very different than the boomer politics, for example. And without putting you too much on the spot, you're kind of more of that generation, and maybe others have other insights on that voting block. But it's a huge voting block. And I wonder to what extent this interventionist diplomacy issue might play out with that large and growing and increasingly powerful, I think, political voting block. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that on both sides. So I know that most of my family is still in Iran, and most of my family are people who look just like me, because Iran is also a disproportionately young country, and I just wanted to note that. On the American side, I know that, again, a lot of people my age who went to college at the same time as I did, our politics was shaped as we were marching against the Iraq War. That was very much when we got our political consciousness. And unlike Vietnam and unlike the generations that came before us, when we marched, we didn't see those same kinds of results. We marched and then the Iraq War happened, and that was really disheartening for a lot of people of my generation. Whereas then being able to engage in a movement around the candidate of President Obama and watching him promise to not just make sure that something like the Iraq War didn't happen, but to change the mindset that led to the Iraq War and then to deliver on the Iran Accord has really been re-energizing for a generation of people in terms of getting back involved in foreign policy and believing that everyday people can make the same kind of impact in this space as they can in a domestic level issue basis. So that, again, I think is one of the most exciting things to come out of this diplomatic accord.
I find it interesting that as the debate was unfolding, we first heard for months that the deal was worthless because Iran would never implement it. Iran wouldn't keep its word. Iran would not do what it promised it would do. Then, as we got to the end of the debate and it became clear that the agreement was going to be signed on both sides, the argument turned around. And the new threat, we were told, is the worst thing is going to happen. Iran is going to implement the agreement. Iran is going to live up to every single commitment. So this will make Iran powerful, and this will make Iran more legitimate in the eyes of the world. So we've now been told both things. It will be terrible if Iran breaks the deal and doesn't observe it. It's also terrible if Iran observes the deal. So, Joe, I want to ask you, how do you see the place that we're going to be at when the new president comes into office? Will enough have been done so that the accord is really deeply rooted, or will it still be fragile enough so that a new president, if so inclined, could undermine it?
Well, the campaign against this nuclear agreement was one of the best funded, most dishonest, most hyperbolic campaign I've ever seen against any national security agreement. So there were all kinds of lies told about it, all kinds of false metaphors and analogies made, like Mr. Netanyahu's flushing the evidence down the toilet claims. It's going to take a while to overcome that, but I think, as others have pointed out, over the next few months, we should be seeing videos and photos and reports of something that is rarely seen. A country physically disassembling a nuclear complex it spent billions to build. In fact, the only thing I can think of that's close to this is the agreement that with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan at the end of the Cold War, where those countries gave up the thousands of nuclear weapons they had inherited with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and you saw pictures of the planes and the subs physically being cut up and destroyed. But again, those weren't their weapons. They were the Soviet weapons left on them. Here you have a nuclear complex that Iran invested its national prestige, some of its top scientists, and billions of dollars to build, and now it's taking it down. So as that progresses over the next few months, the Iranians believe that they can fulfill all the terms of their agreement by the end of November. I don't know any Americans who believe that it could happen that fast, but let's say it's January or February of this year. Once that happens, that's when the U.S. and Europe and the other countries in the world lift the sanctions. That's when Iran really becomes open for business. And so that's happening fairly quickly, you know. And so even while the presidential campaign is happening, while President Obama is still in office, by January or February or so, you should see this. The European businessmen, as you point out in your article, Stephen, are already there. They're ready to cut deals. There's a lot of money to be made in Iran, a lot of unmet, pent-up infrastructure needs. So you're going to see all that. I think you'll then start seeing American television reporters, etc., going to Tehran and looking at it in a new way, similar to some of the way you saw with Americans going to Havana after we started the process of restoring diplomatic relations. If this is accompanied by a true moderation of Iranian behavior. And it might be, if this is accompanied by cooperation on Syria and Yemen and against ISIS, you could have a very different political calculation by the time a new president takes office in January 17. Could that new president pull the plug on this agreement? Yes. But if things develop favorably, if everything goes well, it'll be extremely difficult for a president to reverse what is seen or will be seen as a very favorable circumstances for the United States as the success of this agreement and the success of engagement with Iran.
I can jump in here, if that's okay. I think the notion at first was Iran will never comply with this deal. And once that argument was sort of deflated, it then became, well, Iran will abide by the deal, get all the restricted money that it's been owed, and then the sanctions relief, and this is going to unleash a emboldened Iran that will undercut U.S. interests at every corner of the Middle East. So, you know, that has been, I think, for those of us that have been an advocate for this deal, I think that's one of the biggest questions and criticisms we've been facing ourselves. When I look at this question, I think Syria, the crisis in Syria, will be the next big test for Iran. You know, for so long, the United States had a red line that Iran could not be at the table, and secondly, that Assad had to go before anything could happen. And because of this, we greatly limited our options. So while we were able to stand on principle, you know, against this brutal dictator, the bottom line is we boxed ourselves out of pursuing a real solution. This issue could have been addressed back in January 2014 at the Geneva II conference on Syria, where first Iran was invited and then disinvited. But now, because of the nuclear deal, we have an opportunity to have Iran at the table, and we will see how that plays out. So this is going to be Iran's big test now, is whether or not it can play the constructive role it says it wants to play in bringing about a political settlement. Foreign Minister of Iran, Javad Zarif, has outlined a 4-point plan for dealing with Syria. It includes first a ceasefire, then the formation of a unity government, followed by constitutional reforms, and then broad elections under international supervision. That's a reasonable plan. And privately, and I think even now publicly to some extent, Iranian officials have been indicating that Assad would be part of this process, transition process, but he would not be there at the end of the process. So this is a time for us for the Iranians to come to the table, present their cards, and let's see if we can get this diplomatic engagement going.
I want to ask Sarah and Barbara, who have a lot of experience inside Iran, a question about domestic developments there. Now, I'm going to read a tweet that the Supreme Leader sent out as this agreement was being signed. He's referring to the Americans and Westerners who supported it. They promise that Iran will be totally different in 10 years. We must not allow such evil prospects and thoughts. Now, this agreement is definitely not about Iranian internal politics. Both sides made clear that that was off the table. On the other hand, underneath it, not so far beneath the surface, everybody understood that this was a factor that certainly is bubbling. How can we imagine Iranian society changing as a result of this agreement? It's not, doesn't have any direct effect on Iranian society. On the other hand, it's changing such a fundamental aspect of Iranian reality that it seems to me it can't help but have some effect on the way Iranians live and the way Iranians govern themselves. And maybe that's what the Supreme Leader is worried about. Are his fears justified? Barbara?
Yeah, they are, and that's frankly what concerns me, because what I'm seeing is a lot of fear on the part of Khamenei and many of the hardliners in the country about the transformational implications of this deal. I agree with you. I think it changes everything. You know, 2 years of one-on-one talks between Iran and the Great Satan after all these years of saying, you know, of Iran being rather skittish about it, although we should admit there were times in the past when they wanted to talk and we didn't, particularly under the George W. Bush administration. But I think we're seeing a tremendous rearguard defensive action on the part of Khamenei. I think he's throwing a lot of bones to the IRGC in particular, and unfortunately to the IRGC's intelligence division, which is the one that is arresting and holding Americans. There are reports of another Iranian American who's been picked up recently. And I'm very worried that these activities in Iran are going to resonate in Washington in such a way that people on our side will say, you see, you can't trust them. Yeah, maybe they're implementing the nuclear deal, but they're a bad country. And we should make sure that we contain them, that we double down on containment, because this is not a good place. So this unhealthy dynamic between the hardliners on both sides, you know, is concerning. At the same time, I'm searching for a way, and maybe Sarah has some ideas, about how we defend human rights in Iran and advocate for human rights in Iran and advocate for Iranian Americans without making the situation worse and without making the regime even more paranoid and even more likely to lash out.
Sarah, what's your perspective on this?
So, just a quick anecdote. I know that a lot of my family loves referring to President Obama as Mr. Hussein, which has also provided an interesting challenge on that front, where the supposed great Satan's president has Hussein as one of his names. I think that the sanctions were crippling and had a very disproportionate effect on a lot of people in Iran. And seeing a move to ease that is going to be transformational in the lives of many, in terms of making sure that they have what they need to succeed in their own individual lives. And I think when a country has almost 60% of its population are under 30, those economic impacts are going to be even more crucial. Iran is such a disproportionately young country. It's such a disproportionately technology-orientated country. It has one of the highest rates of internet connectivity in the Middle East. And those two factors combined are incredibly exciting. And I think that we should really be paying attention to the stories coming out of Iran, the initiatives that are happening to tackle environmental issues, tackle all kinds of different things that are really bringing interesting players together in Iran and connecting them and supporting those voices.
Hey, Stephen, yeah, you were just muted there. Could I just add one thing while we're here? Because, I mean, I have encouraged people from the beginning to add questions. There have been some interesting questions from the audience. One does have to do with a little bit of the human rights side of things, where one person asked, Mr. Kinzer, talking on Iran and calling it a chessboard, how do you see Iran's approach in arresting Iranian Americans? Does Iran see them as pawns of American diplomacy or American policy? There's a little bit of Barbara, what you just mentioned there. There is concern about the internal implications there on the negative side. I just want to acknowledge that question, but also it is addressed to you, Stephen, if you had a thought, but also if anyone else has a thought before you jump in.
I think it is true, as Barbara suggested, that part of the motivation for these arrests has been a desire on the part of hardliners in Iran to make Iran look bad in the West. They want to give ammunition to their counterparts in Washington. They want Americans to turn against Iran and try to weaken this deal. So what could be better than arresting the Washington Post correspondent? They are trying to provoke us, and I think to a certain degree they're going to be successful. It's very distressing to see this dynamic unfolding, and it shows you the distressing fact that unelected leaders in Iran still have tremendous amounts of power, and that while we are dealing with the elected government, there's a completely different structure that's quite opaque and beyond, in some ways, the reach of this agreement. I wanted to follow up on the question of change inside Iran with Sarah. I thought your comments were interesting, but let me press you a little based on something that Barbara said. It's very exciting to see how civil society is bubbling over there. The internet culture is huge. The underground rock and roll culture is huge. The westernized orientation of young Iranians is very impressive. On the other hand, is this something that's going to go so far that the established leaders in the religious political establishment are going to feel obligated to come down and crack down on? Certainly if Iran begins to change too dramatically too quickly, there are some people, some of us would love that, but some people in Iran won't, and that might push us back rather than bring us forward. Do you think that there's a little bit too much hope and effervescence and ambition on the part of your generation in Iran, and is that dangerous potentially?
I don't think hope and pragmatism are counteropposed. I think that there's like a new generation of leadership also coming to the fore who will be coming to the fore over the next decades. And they will have had a very different upbringing and a very different political experience than the current leaders of establishment. What that will look like, I think, is really hard to say. And the classic challenge with making any kind of future suggestions around what the Middle East is going to look like is that they're almost always wrong. But I think all of the key ingredients are there for us to have hope. And it might not, like, that change might not look like what we as people in the West might want it to look like, but it might have very important impacts for the people who are in Iran, and giving them the space to really shape what they want their country to look like, and making sure that the change they want is the change that they're at the forefront of creating is the most crucial piece of this puzzle.
Let me make one observation, then I'm going to ask Suzanne if she'd like to comment on this. One thing I've noticed in my trips to Iran, and one thing I really have learned from Iranians, is the sense that you don't want to push history too fast. The Iranians learned a profound lesson from their 1978-79 uprising. They all banded together, even though they disagreed with each other, because they all agreed on one thing, that we didn't know what comes after the Shah, but it will definitely be better. Didn't necessarily work out that way. Iranians in the Green Movement also showed that when the police came down and beat them, they went back to their houses. They didn't do what the Syrians did, was decide we're going to pick up guns and start a revolution. They are interested in change that is sustainable, not change that's overnight. And it was quite terrifying to me when I heard Hillary Clinton saying that one of her greatest regrets in office was that she didn't give more support to the Green Movement, which to me meant that she regretted maybe not having pushed them to rebel even more than they did. So I appreciate the desire of Iranians not to provoke situations that might drag Iran down into the kind of conflicts that are happening in other parts of the region. So, having said that, Suzanne, what is your perspective on what you think might be happening inside Iran as a result of, or in the wake of, this accord?
Well, I agree with some of the previous comments. I do think that this is a very critical moment domestically for Iran. There is a lot of, I think, worry and concern. Let's put it this way. If I was an Iranian decision maker, right now, one of the things I would be most concerned with is how is the nuclear deal, Iran's opening to the world, its reintegration into the global economy, how is that going to affect society? And we do know that Iran is a very dynamic society for all the reasons Sarah mentioned. It's young, it's educated, it's sophisticated, it's connected through the internet and other means. So this is a society in motion. So if I was an Iranian policymaker, I'd be thinking about this question very deeply. Now, just this morning I had a briefing by the Ahmed Shahid, the UN Special Representative for Human Rights in Iran, and he painted a very distressing picture of the human rights situation there. In fact, he sees the situation worsening over these past 5 years, an increase in executions, an uptick in the arrests in journalists, new legislation that is going to give men preference when it comes to hiring over women in the workplace. A lot of troubling things happening. Now, we can look at this as a reaction to President Rouhani's effort to engage with the world and open Iran up. And maybe that is the case. So we should be very watching this very carefully if we continue to see moving in this direction. We know the judiciary operates separately from the government, that President Rouhani does not have influence over these issues, as we've seen in the case of Jason Rezaian. So this is something I think we should be keeping an eye on. On the other side of the equation, because of the nuclear deal now, a lot of average, ordinary Iranians that have been suffering because of the sanctions, hopefully that will now be alleviated. A lot of humanitarian aspects there. Also, I think the prospect of commercial diplomacy can't be emphasized. What is it going to mean? And we must be clear that U.S. businesses are not going to be going into Iran anytime soon, unless, of course, it's Boeing. But what is the impact European, Asian corporations and businesses and direct investment is going to have on Iran? This will be, so ultimately I think the business community is going to be playing a big role in how Iran's future course is set, whether it's on economic issues, political issues, but also social issues as well.
Hey, if I could just, that's a terrific point. I just want to say, as we're winding out here, we're getting close to the end of our session, I really thought it would be good to cycle in at least another question from the outside that I think is particularly interesting, and it's shifting the topic somewhat, but I think it's worth describing. This is on the site. It was actually posted before the conversation started, but it's quite useful, and I think it also, Stephen, I think you could directly answer it too. It's from Marisa Guerre, and it says, can the agreement also bring a rapprochement between Turkey and Iran to create a northern tier in order to block this time not the communist expansion, but the expansion of jihadism and Wahhabism? Turkey and Iran are the most powerful, stable, and democratic, not the al-Hoya regime in Iran, but its population, Muslim countries of the Middle East, and they're not so different as we think. Shia are also in Turkey. The Kurdish is a common issue, and the economic interrelation is evident. Anyhow, a thoughtful conversation, and particularly given you your last book, Stephen, maybe could you just address that, and maybe Barbara or others actually relate to that? Because I think it's again thinking more regionally there, but I think it's a useful way to think about that. You're muted, Stephen. You're muted.
There I go. Okay, so several years ago I did produce this book called Reset, Iran, Turkey, and America's Future, and I did some speaking about that theme when that book first came out. I essentially made the argument that Turkey and Iran were our logical long-term partners in that part of the world. When I was making those speeches, I had the same response all the time in all my interviews and from people in the audience, and they said, well, Turkey, it makes sense. Turkey's very much like us. Turkey's on our side. But Iran, it just seems crazy. It's completely out of the question. Now, it's almost being reversed. Turkey has become a most unreliable and unpleasant ally. It has, in some ways, taken the side of ISIS. It has helped ISIS militants pass through its territory. It's bombing forces that are trying to fight ISIS. And Iran has emerged as willing to take casualties and make great sacrifices to fight against ISIS and other Sunni terror groups in the Middle East. So I think our concern in trying to work out the accord that your questioner asked is not so much exclusively with Iran anymore. Turkey also has to begin to get with the program. We're having an election in Turkey this coming Sunday. That may have some effect. But Turkey and Iran make logical partners for each other and for the United States. But that's only going to be sustainable if their internal politics allow that. And for the last couple of years, that has not been possible in Turkey. Turkey's caused us more trouble in that part of the world, really, than Iran has.
Yeah, if I could jump in here. Turkey and Iran have a very strong commercial relationship, though. Let's not forget that Turkey buys Iranian oil, and many Iranians go to Turkey for tourism. You don't need a visa to go back and forth. So, you know, they've maintained actually a pretty decent relationship through a lot of ups and downs. And Erdogan, when he was prime minister of Turkey, of course, tried to mediate a nuclear deal, you know, back in 2010. So I think that Stephen's original thesis actually may wind up being a solid one. The problem, again, goes back to Syria, and here I agree with Suzanne. This is the big test. We have a horrible war going on in the middle of the Middle East, and we have Iran and Russia supporting a brutal, murderous dictator. We've got the United States and others supporting various other groups in what is a very confused picture on the opposition side. And so if there's an ability to start to sort that out, which would need Turkish buy-in as well, you know, then perhaps we can see this in a different way. But going back to your original question about this, you know, the way I see it is that the Iran deal gives us new options. It doesn't necessarily mean that we change our old alliances. We certainly are not going to do that overnight. But it gives us new options, new ways of approaching regional problems, and a way of seeing them from a different perspective that we didn't really always take into account before.
Well, I think we've come to a point where maybe I could make a few closing observations. I think we've touched on some of the key points here, and if I could summarize a couple of them, I would say this. When countries are looking for partners in the world, we really should be looking for two things. First of all, countries that have long-term strategic goals that more or less match our own, and secondly, societies that look a little bit like ours. By those standards, Iran is a tantalizing potential partner. This nuclear accord is a quantum strategic leap. Whether it can be the basis for a new relationship between Iran and the outside world, and especially between Iran and the United States, still remains uncertain. But as we've heard here today, Iran's strategic orientation in the Middle East and the structure of its society is amenable to that. It's open to that. So this accord is profoundly far-reaching in itself, as Joe Cirincione pointed out. It removes a hugely destabilizing factor in the Middle East, which is the potential for a nuclear-armed Iran. But its potential goes far beyond the single dispute that it is designed to resolve. It offers all kinds of tantalizing strategic and economic possibilities. I think it opens up a prospect out of isolation for Iran, and it decisively advances Western security interests. In a region where hope is hard to come by, that makes this accord uniquely promising and something that we should all work to try to root into our foreign policy.
Well, I think that is an excellent way to actually end the conversation. We're basically at the end of the session here. It's been a terrific kind of forum here to actually get a lot of big ideas out, how to really fundamentally rethink Iran and its implications in the region. And it's been a terrific way to start the series of reinventing American foreign policy. So thank everyone in the roundtable here who is contributing. Thank the audience also for being here. And Stephen, particularly, thank you for leading what it's been a terrific conversation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you.